Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday discussion. Today's essay is Basic Principles of Literature. Today we have James, as always, and also we have Don, which is, according to the topic that we're going to talk today, is going to discuss us, and who better than him to discuss about that than a person who has just published his novel. And without anything further ado, let me start asking a question first to James, and then Don, if you want to complete with his answer. Could you explain what is the essence of this essay?
Well, this is an extended essay that appeared in the summer of 1968, first in the Objectivist magazine, written by the novelist Ayn Rand, probably the greatest novelist America has ever produced, in which she explains her own theory of literature. And her basic approach breaks up literature into the standard component parts: theme, plot, characterization, style. But what Ayn Rand, of course, does is she integrates it with her own distinctive aesthetic philosophy and, in fact, her wider philosophy, and gives each of these elements, gives profound insight into each of these elements in a way that no aesthetician had or literary critic had before Ayn Rand. For example, the role of free will, for example, in creating a romantic plot, or the role of form following function in the creation of a literary style, for example. Each of these elements is given profound new insight when Ayn Rand connects it to the deeper ideas of her philosophy. And I just have to say, in echo, we're really privileged to have Don today. I have my copy ordered; it's on its way, but I have not yet read what you've written and published lately. I Am Justice. I love the title. The description sounds fascinating. But we have a real live novelist here, not just a philosopher, but a practitioner of literature here, an artist, Don. So take it from there, please.
Yeah, well, thanks to both of you. And yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with all that in terms of what she's trying to do. I think about it as one of her goals was to inspire a revival of romanticism. And I think what part of what she's trying to do here is it's not exactly a how-to, but it's trying to explain what is a novel from a romanticist perspective. Like, what is this art form? And if you understand that, then that gives you, as a creator, insight into what it means to create a novel. What is it that kind of defines this sphere of artistic creation? And so she's kind of mapping out the components and saying, like, this is what we should aspire to create if we actually want to create great literature.
Don, could you talk broadly about what is a novel? Because this essay is mostly focused on the structure of a novel and what are its main components according to this essay.
Well, I mean, so one thing to say is that in terms of the storytelling arts, so it's a story, first of all. And in terms of kind of the storytelling arts, now, in a sense, I just released about 10 minutes ago an interview I did with Luke Travers, who's an art guide in the visual arts. And his view, and I think he's right, is that, every painting, or at least most paintings, most sculptures tell a story. But if we're taking it literally as the storytelling arts, whether it's plays, short stories, she thinks the novel is kind of the highest form of storytelling because of its length, and because it doesn't have to be kind of interpreted by the performing arts and limited in that way. It gives you the most scope, the most capacity as a storyteller. And one way to think about it is to contrast it with other kind of its most similar neighbors. So, versus a short story, just the whole scope of what you can handle and the kind of stories you can tell is much, much more enormous. I think the most telling kind of distinctions are, if you think about a play is really a story told in dialogue. Now, there's actors moving around the stage, but it's the words that is the essence of the art. And if you think about movies, the way it'll usually be put is that they're stories told in pictures. that yes, there's a dialogue, but it's really the visuals that are telling the story. And in a novel, it's concepts. It's words telling a story, and it's giving us action, dialogue. And though Rand doesn't stress this, one of the things that I think is most profoundly distinctive and amazing about a novel is that it allows us inside a character's mind. We don't just see what they do and hear what they say, but we can see the thinking, the decision making that's going on in their minds. And if you think about Rand's conception of romantic art as defined by free will and distinctive about free will, I mean, there's no other art form that gives you as much direct access to choice making as the novel. And so I think, this is kind of why she's carving it out. She's a novelist, so this is the art form she knows the most about. But in terms of the storytelling arts, it is, in many ways kind of the a height of what's possible in storytelling.
Yeah, you're kind of like God there in terms of being able to look inside your characters, get a God's eye view, third person perspective on things, and you can, given the scope, you can really get into a psychology, a topic, a philosophical theme, an emotional theme, in a way that probably no other literature has. That's fascinating.
Now let's start with the parts that Rand divides the novel in. And the first part is theme. Don, could you explain us what is the theme? Maybe give us some example of some novels' themes.
Yeah, and so every work of art has a theme. It has something it's trying to say. Otherwise, it's I think it's towards the end when Rand's talking about style, she talks about finger exercises for a pianist. Or mood exercises for a writer. And those are all fine and good. But if we're talking about art, it's trying to say something about life. And the theme is what it's trying to say. It's the abstract statement that the art is expressing. And we'll contrast it later with the kind of plot and the other elements. But if you think about plot as the specific events of the story, and what theme is really getting to is what does it add up to? And from an artist's perspective, you have an abstraction. In Ayn Rand's journals, I think she has this really interesting formulation that I believe Leonard Peikoff reprints in the foreword to, or the preface to Atlas Shrugged, where she talks about what an artist is doing is translating their theme into the kind of concrete event. So in that sense, it's kind of like a process of deduction. And that for the reader, it's a process of induction, that they see the events, they meet the characters, and then they have to work to grasp the abstract theme. And what it's really doing for the artist, aside from I have something I want to say, is that it then acts as a standard of selection. So for people who have read The Fountainhead, part of what we get, and we'll talk about this more when we get to plot and plot theme, part of what we get is this idea that in order to create anything, the act of creation is really integrating things around a central idea, and that central idea serves as a standard of selection for what do I include and what do I not include. And Rand's view is that ultimately this is done by the theme. And so, for example, I mean, the theme of Atlas Shrugged, as she puts it, is the role of the mind in man's life. And so that's kind of what in reality she wants to talk about, what she wants to concretize. And then everything else in the novel is chosen in such a way that it adds up to that theme. So there's more to say about it, but that's at least at the kind of basic level what a theme is and what it's for. So it's what the reader walks away with, and it's what the artists use to guide the creation of their piece.
What the artwork is saying.
And Don, what does the idea of form follows purpose mean?
Okay, yeah. So I was going to correct you, and then I realized no, you were correct. So the phrase that people are probably familiar with is form follows function. So this comes out of architecture. I don't think it's in The Fountainhead, but anybody who's read The Fountainhead will probably have heard it. it's often attributed to Frank Lloyd Wright, but I think it was Sullivan, his teacher, who was the one who formulated this idea. And what it is if you think about it in terms of architecture, right? It's, what is this building for? Before I'm going to build it, I have to know what the damn thing is for. Like, is this a hospital? Is this a home for what kind of person? So I need to know what it's for. And that's going to determine every detail. It's going to determine, okay, well, how many rooms does it need to have? What kind of materials should I use? What kind of cost can I have? If this is a home for a struggling artist, that's going to have a much different impact on the building than if it's a home for Gail Winan. So it's your basic standard. Your function or your purpose is going to determine the form. It's going to determine every detail down to what it looks like, down to even kind of the I went to Taliesin West, which is Frank Lloyd Wright, one of his schools, and my tour guide was explaining that the proportions of certain tiles in the ground stood in an exact relationship to the proportions of the tile on the roof or something like that, and why that was important and so on. But it's all those details ultimately flow up into what's the purpose of this building. And so if you think about form follows purpose, or no, what's the quote that she uses?
But she says form follows purpose is the equivalent of form follows function, right?
Yeah, and so it's the form of the novel follows your purpose. And so, for instance, if you're going to have a novel on, the role of the mind in human life, well, that's going to determine a lot about the story. And for instance, it's probably not going to. That's a bad example because it's such a wide abstraction that ultimately you could probably, concept in a hat your way to a reason why it would be. But if you take, for instance, Ayn Rand has, she refers to the theme of Gone with the Wind as something like the contrast between the old South and the new South in the midst of, and wake of the Civil War. Well, then you're probably not going to set it in 1975, right? Like there's, or by that, or by 1789. So that's a kind of obvious example, but it's the way in which, okay, the thing I want to say is going to determine the details of the piece. Or now this is a little bit, well, I'll just use this example. So if you think about Ayn Rand's style, and if anybody who's read Art of Fiction, she says a lot about her own style there. She says, I think, a little bit in the Romantic Manifesto about it, or the way that she talks about Mickey Spillane. So her style is kind of just super clear, super precise, not a lot of just, if you contrast it with Victor Hugo, kind of flowing language, throwing out 30 metaphors, and that's kind of his kind of bold, blustering, emotional style. But in her mind, but in her view, like she's writing about the power of reason and the power of man's focused mind. And so there would be this clash in style and in content if Victor Hugo's style had told the story of Atlas Shrugged. Now that's, it'd be kind of an interesting thing to read, but that's, I think, the kind of way in which, flowing all the way down to the details of a novel, her theme is setting the standard for everything, including the style that she had to cultivate. Because if you read We the Living, and she said that she still hadn't formulated her style. It wasn't until The Fountainhead that she had developed her own style. And then you can read We the Living, and there's very Hugo-esque passages in there. Particularly, there's a description of St. Petersburg, Russia, that, I mean, you read it and you go, this is, I mean, it's not imitative in the bad sense. Like, it really is eloquent and powerful, but it's not Ayn Rand as we know her. And she needed to develop that style in order to tell the stories that she wanted to, precisely because form follows purpose.
Right. So you can kind of see, like in Gone with the Wind, the theme of the old order and the new order are personified in Ashley Wilkes and Rhett Butler, and the through the eyes of the main character, Scarlett O'Hara, she's got to choose between these two men she really loves. Or in Ayn Rand's Anthem, we have a sort of a biblical style and an abbreviated style, which would have been totally inappropriate, say, to get into the psychological and moral themes of the Fountainhead. So you've got to choose I'm no artist, but as a lover of literature, it appears to me that the artist has got to choose carefully every element to make sure that it's consistent with the theme that they're actually trying to express.
Isn't it a bit similar with this interview with Steve Jobs that became viral a couple of years ago, in which someone says to him, like, Steve, you don't know anything because there's this magnificent technical computational thing that you don't use and you took away from your software development. And Steve Jobs answers something like,
"We're losing your connection." Your connection.
I agree that it may be functional, but at the same time, what we're trying. Sorry, Jay.
Oh dear. Oh, we're back. Well, I think we may have lost Alejandro. His connection was poor there, and I'm not sure how next to the question, but I think it may have been connected. There was something about Steve Jobs, but we'll let him, when he gets his connection back, get back to that. But I wonder if you could, at this point, Don, comment on the relationship between plot and theme. Ayn Rand seems to believe that plot and theme are so intimately connected that they can't be separated. And in fact, all these elements can't be really separated except abstractly in our thought. But plot and theme in her mind have to be tightly integrated. Could you explain more what that means?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really, if you try to think about like the challenge, like let's say I have something I want to say and I want to write a novel. So a novel has, let's call it 500 pages, maybe 1,000, maybe 250, but it has, 50 scenes, 100 scenes, 300 scenes. And how in the world am I going to write, 500 pages and dozens of scenes and have it say something? Like, what does that even look like? And what kind of process am I going to go through? And so you have to have a way to translate your theme into the kind of structure of a story. And so she has this idea of a plot theme, which is really one way to think about it, is it's kind of a one sentence statement of the essence of the action that would communicate the theme if executed as a story. And then that really in practice becomes your standard of selection. Because if I say the role of the mind in human life, but I don't have the mind on strike, or the men of the mind go on strike against an altruist collectivist society, well, there's infinite things I could do, and I have no way to choose between them, and I don't know where to start, and I don't know where to go. But if I have the plot theme, then that's going to allow me to kind of unravel a story that I know is going to add up to the theme, because it's built right into the core of what the story is. So if I know that the men of the mind go on strike against an altruist collectivist society, that is going to illustrate the role of the mind in human life. And that suggests a story. It suggests the basic conflict that allows me to figure out, all right, who are my characters? What's my plot? How is this all going to unfold? And so it's really a tool from the writer's perspective about how do I make sure that I'm saying something while I'm making decisions about the story itself. And from the reader's perspective, it's really how you get to the theme. There's more that goes into it, but you have to identify, all right, what really is this story about? Like, what is the core story here? And then that's going to suggest the theme. Because if you think about something like Les Miserables, like it's not obvious. Like you have Jean Valjean. Well, first of all, you have like 100 pages of this priest that we never see again. Jean Valjean steals from him, gets caught, runs away. He's being chased by Javert. There's a whole battle scene and so on. But if you get that the plot theme is, that I forget exactly how Rand puts it, but you basically have like a criminal chased by a man of the law, on his quest for redemption or something like that. Well, now you can see in the way in which, okay, well, like, what is that story saying? What is that story communicating? So it's really a crow epistemology tool. It's how do we condense these complex events in the way that kind of captures the core value conflict that this novel is about, and therefore we answer the question of what this novel is about.
Well, she uses the example of Thomas Mann, and I'm just going to use a new example, a different example that's always been a pet peeve of mine. Through the course of the Star Wars films, we are constantly told this Jedi philosophy about distrusting personal connections and personal relationships, and you shouldn't get too close, love everybody, but not love anyone in particular, and we're told that the dangers of all that. And yet the actual events of the story at the end of it show that the Emperor is only killed and Darth Vader is only defeated because of the personal connections between Darth Vader and Luke, and between Luke and his sister, and they care about those personal relationships, and that's what vindicates the whole thing. So the story tells one thing, personal relationships, rah, rah, they'll save the day, whereas the philosophy that the wise people are saying, like Yoda and Obi-Wan, completely contradicts the actual events and what the events are saying. And that kind of contrast between the philosophy that the philosophers are articulating during the course of the story and what the events actually add up to saying can often be totally different. So that you can get even long philosophical speeches that have absolutely nothing to do with what the plot actually would end up telling you if you just paid attention to the events.
Yeah, and so I think ultimately that's the basic relationship between the plot and the theme is the theme. So set aside what the artist does, but once you have a finished product, the theme is what is expressed by the plot. And it doesn't matter what you shove into your characters' mouths or anything like that. It doesn't matter what you put in your jacket copy. It doesn't matter what in an interview on Charlie Rose, or I guess somebody has not been not been kicked out of the media. It doesn't matter what you intend. It is what is actually expressed by the plot, and that is really what the theme of the novel is. That's what the meaning is. And I mean, that's really crucial, particularly if you come to creating art through objectivism. There's a real it's very easy to, even though you've read Ayn Rand warn about this, have this conflict between what you want to say, what your characters say, but what the actual events of your story communicate. And so ultimately, all that really matters is like, what does the events communicate? Now, it's complicated in that dialogue is part of the action of the novel, but not all dialogue is action. Dialogue is only action when it moves the story forward, when it leads to actual change within the context of the novel. So for instance, if you and I just like, if I put in my next novel, like, hey, James and I hung out and he said that, hey, don't you think that Kant is the greatest philosopher? And I said, no, I think it was probably Ayn Rand, and so on. And then I left, and then like nothing comes of it. There's been no change. There's just some things that happened. Then that's not action, right? But if I say, hey, James, I'm in love with your wife. Now that's an action, right? I've created a situation that is commanding a response. It's going to change our relationship. It's going to say something about me and something about you. And so in that sense, dialogue does move it forward, but kind of empty philosophizing that doesn't lead to change in the characters. And I don't necessarily mean changing their fundamental character, but changing their situation in life, changing their relationships with other people. Then no, it's completely meaningless, and it shouldn't be in a novel, except as kind of a indulgence sometimes.
We've got Alejandro back. Welcome back, Alejandro.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I thought I had sorted out, but still I'm having Wi-Fi issues. Sorry, Did you talk about the plot? Were you talking about the plot?
You talked about
Yeah.
plot and plot theme, but you had a question about that referred to Steve Jobs that we lost that sounded like it might have been fascinating.
It's just something that went viral with Steve Jobs, and someone tells him that there were some opportunities in some technical stuff that he took away in probably the 90s. And he said, it may be great technically, but it's worth nothing. Not much for the product that we wanted to sell, and that's what we took out. And I think that had the relationship with form follows purpose, and it was
Everything, that's a really key point that Ayn Rand makes. Since you're being an artist and you are kind of God in control of everything should be brought into control. Everything should be deliberate. It's not like reality, where things just happen, right? And one thing that happens after another thing, they are not necessarily related to each other. You may have to wait a few days to get the related event, but you can cut out all the irrelevant. And so each and every element, every description, every word choice, every event is on purpose and placed there to further the purpose of the work of art. So every element, form follows function, is sort of a demanding dictate on an artist, something Don would probably know a lot more about, having actually written a novel, because it demands, since you do have this godlike control over everything, that every single thing be intentional, deliberate, and further your purpose.
Yeah, it's certainly true that Steve Jobs approached technology like an artist. And indeed, part of what the Fountainhead is communicating is that all production, all creativity should have the same approach as an artist. That is, you have a purpose that acts as a standard of selection and you integrate everything around it. And so if this feature, so Apple often is referred to as, what they love is simplicity. And I think that's one way to think about what they do. But I mean, you could have there's an old Saturday Night Live, I think, where they created, what was it? It was something like a computer that was the old Apple spin wheel or something. Like, it becomes unusable in its simplicity, and that's not it. It's that we have a purpose and that everything has to feed this purpose. And it is, I mean, it's the hardest thing about art. And indeed, one of the things that you see in the Fountainhead is when Rourke first starts out, he doesn't know how to implement form follows function fully and consistently. He has these creative ideas, these bold ideas. He's a lot of talent. But when he goes to Cameron's like, why the hell did you indent this plan? You thought it looked pretty? And what it was is Rourke had to make a decision where he hadn't yet figured out, how do I translate my overall purpose into this kind of very small scale decision? And basically he just resorted to intuition and what looked nice or something like that. And Cameron's view is, no, if you're really going to be an architect, you have to form premises, or you could think of them as sub premises, that allow you to execute the purpose that you're after down to the smallest detail. And certainly I don't have that yet in literature. And Rand talks about that as, like in her commentary in Mickey Spillane, the way in which his early novels kind of show he doesn't have full control over his style yet. And I felt like that's how I felt. I mean, that's how I felt as a writer back in the day when I was still learning in nonfiction. And certainly, even with, I mean, this is my third novel, but the first published one is still, I'm forming those sub premises. I don't have full control over it yet. And so it's not going to be a fully integrated plot, theme, and characterization and style the way that, the greatest novelists pull off. But that's what you're shooting for. You're shooting for that kind of full control and full integration. And somebody like Steve Jobs, I think, is somebody who did that in business. And it's a really, I mean, that is, it's an enormous achievement. And then as the user, you don't know that that's exactly what's happening, that everything's been integrated around a key idea and so on, but you experience it with, this thing is beautiful and it's amazing. It's so easy to use. And I got to tell all my friends about it. And it's the same thing with a person who, in 1945 or whatever, picks up the Fountainhead and goes, oh my gosh, you guys have to read this. This is so inspiring and exciting. They don't know what she's doing exactly, but they have the experience that she wants them to have.
Have you already talked about what does it mean to be purposeful in the plot?
Oh, and if I can augment that as a question to Don, what is the relationship that, Ayn Rand makes a key point here about free will and the purposefulness of a romantic plot as opposed to other approaches to literature? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, hold on. I think I had a note to remind me to say something about that I was sure I was going to forget. And now it's very likely I will forget where the note is. Let's see. Oh, well, I'm sure I'll say something about it. Well, so her basic point she makes is that, so she defines plot as something like a purposeful progression of events leading to a climax, of logically connected events leading to a climax. And part of what is striking about her explanation of plot is that she thinks that it's driven really by a concern for realism. So usually plot is thought of as a contrivance. Even people who are pro-plot and think you should engage in plot, it's a contrivance that we use to make a story interesting or whatever. But her view is that no, man is purposeful, that even when they're acting irrationally, there's a certain logic to it. And that you can't talk about human life without talking about the logic of the events. Oh, I remember what I was going to make, but it's kind of a complicated point. So I mapped it out. Let's see. Okay, here it is. And so it's, well, what is it that makes events logically? So I was going to talk about this in connection with characterization, but it's kind of interesting to talk about it now. So what is it to say a logically connected events? Well, it's not just, you could come up with one that was just pure like physics, right? Like he dropped the ball, it landed on the lady died, the emergency people came. So that's kind of logical in the sense that those are things that, would predictably happen. But a story is about human beings and about their values. And so what it is that Tora Beckman once gave this analogy, which is if you saw a boulder falling off like a, high wall and like landing somebody, falling towards somebody in the beach, you don't have a story. But if they're just sitting on the beach, you don't have a story. But if the boulder rolls off and they roll out of the way, now you do. And the idea is that in general, our activities don't reveal character. They don't reveal our basic values. Because your values could direct you in any number of ways, or you could be doing something for any number of reasons. So like, if I just pick up my phone and look at it, or if I, scratch my beard or something like that, that doesn't mean anything. But if you put a character in a situation that is where their goals and values dictate a certain kind of action, and if they had different goals and values, it was dictate a different kind of action. Well, now you're in a position to have a logically connected series of events. And so schematically, the way that it works is, given who a character is, they must do X in this situation. And then given that they do X, Y has to happen. And then given Y, the character must do Z. So it's this interplay with the values and goals of a character, the situation, and then you have a revolving effect. So, for example, a man shoots his wife, right? And there's a person in the room. Well, the person in the room screams and runs away. Well, that reveals a certain character, right? Maybe they're weak, they're scared, they're untrained in what to do. Or it's Jack Reacher and he dives, takes the gun away, pummels the guy and kind of leaves him bloody and dead, right? Like that reveals another kind of character. And so the plot is going to be this interplay where the logic is driven both by, the events themselves, but mediated through the character of the characters in the story. And so she makes the point that it's purposeful both from the perspective of the characters and the perspective of the author, that from an author, these are logically connected in the sense of they're adding up to the theme that I want to express. And then from the character's perspective, they're logically necessitated by my values. And so, I mean, we could go through tons of examples from Ayn Rand's fiction. But for instance, take a super complex character, and maybe I should probably pick something simple, but this is just the first thing that came to mind. Why does Dominique marry Peter Keating? Well, the only reason you can answer that is because it's logically necessitated given who she is, given what makes her tick, to use another phrase that Rand uses, which is that she wants to eviscerate herself at this point in the novel, given that she's seen the greatest tragedy possible befall Rourke, confirming her malevolent view of the universe, that of course the man of integrity and ability is doomed to failure from this world. And so, like, given that kind of situation, then she has to look for what's the worst thing I can do to myself, to live a completely willless, like valueless life, while I have to, marry a complete zero and kind of wipe myself out of existence. But then, as the plot goes on, we see this doesn't fulfill her purposes, and that necessitates a kind of, I won't recount the fountainhead for you guys, but you can see that it's the given who Dominique is, anything else would have been a contradiction.
Illogical.
Yeah.
At some point, she changes, and her conduct changes because she thinks, she chooses, and Dominique changes. There's a point where Gail Winan tries almost, he's trying to be different, and that has its effect. The role of human choice and thought is different in romantic art. Take Victor Hugo. As you point out, the whole story kind of starts out with this criminal who will be our central character, Jean Valjean, who changes, who makes a decision, realizes, wow, my whole life has been, this kind priest is making me focus on the worthlessness of my previous life, and now I've got to turn it around. So his thinking and his choice has a powerful impact on the logical chain of the rest of the story of Les Mis. So is there a difference, and in fact, is there a sort of a requirement on the part of the novelist to sort of believe that his characters can think and choose, and that will make a difference? I mean, one of the wonderful things about Hugo's novels is that his characters seem to have their lives in the palms of their hands, and they seem to be making critical choices that will set the events off in a different tangent. And Ayn Rand sort of makes the point that, yeah, if you don't believe in free will, you don't believe people can think and choose, you really can't be a romantic artist in that sense.
Yeah, but notice, that's right. But notice that it can't just be that the character starts acting differently, right? And say, oh, that just shows that people have free will. Because, one day Hank Reardon can say, I'm not going to sign over Reardon Metal because it's good. And then the next day he goes, well, I have choice. Well, I guess I'll sign it over, right? It's that for change change has to flow from the events of the story. And that's why, what we see is, like, Reardon is a great example, right? Because he undergoes a radical change, but what you see is both the material for his thinking and him thinking about the material, and realizing that, I thought I had a duty to love a wife who didn't love me, didn't show any interest in me, indeed, like, tried to take down everything that I valued. And then starting to realize all that leads to is destruction. And I thought that I was doing it because I was giving her the benefit of the doubt because I didn't understand her. And I came to realize that, no, if you don't understand somebody, like, the benefit of the doubt is exactly what they're looking for, because that's what gives them control over you. So it's that his free will is him processing the material of the novels and leading him, therefore, to take a definite stand of, like, no, these are my principles now. These are my commitments. These are my premises. These are my values. And that's going to send me off in a different direction. And Hugo, does the same thing. And one of the things you'll notice is I mean, one of the most powerful scenes in the novel, of course, is where Jean Valjean has kind of escaped detection and seems to have gotten away with remaking himself under a new name and so on. And suddenly there's a man who's unjustly accused of being the criminal Jean Valjean. And he's trying to decide, what is he going to do? Should he let this poor guy take the heat? I mean, after all, he's doing so much good as this new man. Isn't it for the greater good? And he struggles with this for, I don't remember how many, but it's page after page after page, just him going back and forth. And so what you see is that the free will is, not just the ability to act differently, it's to endorse a set of values and premises that are going to kind of lead you forward. And those can change, but they have to change out of the logic of the story. And that's one of the hard things to pull off, because I have a character who undergoes something like that in my novel. And it's, you can't, if the change is arbitrary, like a reader properly doesn't like that. And so it's, how do you make it really compelling that a person reflecting on what's happened to them would actually, endorse a different set of either premises or values or both?
Great answer. Great answer.
Good question.
Could you talk, Don, a bit more about the universality of the story? What does it mean that Winans' conflicts are applicable to the grocery clerk, but the grocery clerk's conflicts aren't applicable to Winans?
Yeah, this is a really interesting passage. And the first time that I read it, or I should say, the first time I reread it today, my reaction was, that's a weird thing to say, because there's plenty of great stories you could tell that we could all relate to about a grocery store clerk. But Rand says they wouldn't even be applicable to another grocery store clerk. And I said, oh, I must have missed something. And if you go back and read the way she puts it, it's that because of the conflicts that Winan is facing involve abstract values. That's what makes it relatable. It's not that everybody has to be this larger than life hero or even tragic hero like Winan, but the conflicts have to be about abstract universal values. And her point is that the grocery store clerk is kind of a stand-in for, my conflict is between Billy and his brother, and Billy, he's kind of scruffy, kind of fun, and his brother, he's a little bit more clean cut. Like, it's trying to suggest that kind of superficial concretedness of conflicts versus value conflicts like independence versus second-handedness. And her point is not that you can't write about everyday people, whether at the grocery or anywhere else, but it's that unless you're writing about value conflicts that are universal, your story won't be universal. And so what you want and what you should strive for is grand scale value conflicts with the specificity of a particular person in a particular situation. And the more that those particulars are real, the more real this and relatable this universal value conflict will be.
Right. I think it's really between a real concrete versus a literary abstraction. A store clerk could live a life that would, in a story, that would reveal universal values. Let's say Dostoevsky wrote it and turned him into an axe murderer or something. The fact that he's a grocery clerk wasn't what she was focused on. It's just that it's a particular grocery clerk as opposed to any other grocery clerk. The same would be true of, say, a great journalist. It's not that it's the particular great journalist we're talking about. It's just that Winan, at the scale that he's living, it reveals an abstract universal principle applicable to grocery store clerks and as media magnates alike.
Don, could you talk about what a plot theme is?
Yes, I mentioned a little bit earlier when you were off, but I'll just say a couple more things about it. So the kind of core ideas I mentioned before is that you're trying to find the basic conflict or basic situation that is going to express your theme. And so when we talk about I made the point that Ayn Rand said that what an artist is doing is kind of a process of deduction from the abstract to the particular, and that what a reader is doing is from the particular to the abstract, a process of induction. in both cases, what you're really doing is it's mediated by the plot theme. That is, in order for me as the artist to get from my theme to a story, the whole range of concrete events, I need to have this step in the middle of the basic event or the basic situation or the basic conflict that's going to kind of integrate all of those smaller events. And as the reader, after I read it, I have to kind of start summarizing, condensing, getting rid of the crow, as it were, overcoming the crow rather. And in order to get to the theme, I need to get to the plot theme. It's not the only thing I have to do. But if, for instance, anybody has listened to Leonard Peikoff's 8 Great Plays or read the book that's based on it, I mean, that's part of his methodology is like, what happened in the story, and not, tell me for 30 minutes about what happened, right? But summarize it and ultimately condense it up into one core statement of what it's about. And that allows me then to get to the abstract statement of what it implies or what it's really trying to say.
Let's move to characterization. Could you talk about what it is?
I mean, there's a statement that, character, that plot is the, what is that quote? Oh yeah. Character drives plot and plot reveals character. And I think that's right. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, but what it means that that character drives plot and plot reveals characters, that it's the values and premises that a person holds, that are going to determine how they act. It's going to unleash that chain of logically connected events. And so if you think about, what's the difference between Dominique and Rourke? They both have the same values, but they have different premises. Specifically, she thinks that their shared values are doomed in this world. And he recognizes that no, because they're rational, they're achievable in the long run. Or you can think about value clashes, right? Like if you have, for instance, I mean, take a stark example of Reardon thinks that Reardon metal is good and loves it because it's good. And Lillian and James and all the villains, they would say that they hate it, but they hate Reardon because they know that Reardon metal is, they would claim, bad, but because they know that it's good, right? So you have value clashes, and often you have both premises and values. And what characterization really is it's that essence of a person. The word that Rand uses is motivation, but her view is that what does motivate us is our values and our premises. Now, I should say that not every author believes that that's what motivates people. I mean, the popular thing today, and I think the kind of conventional way of thinking about motivation is usually like it's biographical. So there was a story when they were making the Atlas Shrugged movies of wanting to have Dagny wanting to kind of serve her grandfather Nat Taggart and do him well. It's that kind of like just biographical motivate is to show something in somebody's past that leads them to act the way that they did today. And look, that's legitimate in terms of art. It's not like you're not allowed to do that, but it's from Rand's perspective, that's superficial. And I'd agree. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have past events motivating things, but she would want the past event to be something that reflects a deeper value or a deeper premise, right? And so, in Atlas Shrugged, there is kind of, we get this incredible flashback and so on that's motivating Dagny in her relationship with Francisco, which is, I used to be in love, and then you just basically kind of pushed me away and ran off and became this playboy. That's motivating a lot of her current action. But the whole story surrounds why did that happen, and what about Francisco's values made it happen.
You remind me there, Ayn Rand very frequently will give psychological contextual backgrounds to major characters. She'll explain Ellsworth Toohey's childhood, or the struggle Gail Wynand had as a youth to become successful, or the relationship between Keating and his mother. So it's not as though she's not giving us psychological and developmental reasons, but for her characters and behavior. But what's going on between the ears of the character is what matters. How they're looking at it, how they're evaluating it, how they're responding to it. And that's what's creating their character. It's not just some event, in the normal psychoanalytic state. There's this event and that just deterministically causes the rest. The characters do have mothers and childhoods, except like John Galton and Howard Rourke. They don't come from anywhere, it seems. Just pure thought, I guess. But it's as though it's the thinking that matters in Ayn Rand's character development, not just the event that happens to them in their past.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's even when she does give the Toohey's past, for instance, in many ways he just is self-created in the same way as the heroes. We just don't see them as children, right? I mean, the closest we get is kind of Dagny and Francisco, but even they're teenagers more or less by the time that we meet them. I guess a little younger than that for Dagny, but because it's like, if you imagine, you could totally, like, if I saw Hollywood today doing the Fountainhead, right? You'd have like Toohey getting beaten up by some smart kid or some kid with orange hair, right? And then now, like, that kind of sends him down this dark road. And there's a certain kind of environmental determinism that's implied by that. And so I think Rand was always very careful not to have that in her characters. And so, so there's a funny way in which you preserve free will by showing the characters arriving fully formed in a certain way, whereas if she had showed kind of an event unleashing the kind of person they become, it's actually less suggestive of. Now, I mean, you could do it. I mean, you can show them thinking about it, reaching a conclusions, right? Because you could have Toohey getting beaten up as a little kid and saying and feeling like, what do I make out of this? Like, should I reflect on who I am? No, that makes me uneasy. I mean, you could do it, but and I don't think she would ever do it for a hero. And in part, it's that I mean, she had this line about we only see Galt from Dagny's perspective, and it's that you don't walk too close to a god or something like that. And there's a way that which if you're trying to present the ideal man, I think she would feel seeing him as a kid would diminish him, because as a kid, you're not yet strong, formed, and so on. And so she didn't want anything that, even though in real life they would have been kids and they would have like played checkers and so on. And maybe even stolen a cookie from the cookie jar before they knew better. It would diminish them in the context of the novel. So there's a lot of interesting things, but I actually think it's one area where there's a lot more work that should be done, and that I find endlessly fascinating, which is, what does it even mean to show free will in the context of, and yet show everything propelled by a character's values? Like, there seems to be some tension there, or even, how do you suggest free will when, like, on the page, the characters are always going to do what they're going to do. There's a lot that's fascinating about that question, and I've not seen kind of worked out by people yet.
And let's move to the last element that Rand pitches, which is style. And I'm thinking, Don, specifically, what kind of creative literature grasp in style that a consumer of art cannot?
Well, I think it's not that dissimilar from any other kind of endeavor, right? Like, what's the difference between what Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive grasp about the iPhone that we don't? Well, like, they see how it works. They know why every little decision was made. We might not even realize that there was a decision made. So, for instance, the size of the apps, like, I'm sure, were lots and lots of discussions about exactly how, what sizes it should be. Do we put the headphone jack on the top or the bottom? There's probably all kinds of, considerations about both the components of the parts and the way that people are going to use the phone and so on that go into it. And it's the same thing with a writer. Like, my job is to give you an experience, and you're not going to see the mechanics of how it works, but I am. And one of the tricky parts, because I write genre fiction, like and I probably will always do this, but at least for now, I'm interested in writing crime novels. And the thing that you realize is that people who read crime novels over and over and over again, they start to notice a lot of the mechanics. And so you have to take that into account, because so much of what you do can become predictable if you don't take into account that they know how it works in a way that maybe 50 years ago they wouldn't have known. Oh, okay, well, we saw this person walk on early in the novel for no real reason, so clearly that's the bad guy, right?
Right.
Or I mean, to take, a really sad trope, you're watching a horror movie and a black person comes on screen. Oh, they're going to die, first, right? Like, there's these things that that you start to see and pick out. But as the author, it's that you need to be in control of that, because you have to actually execute on it, and you have to know why the reader's having the experience that they're having. And you have to, and this is one of the hardest things about learning how to be an author, is that, like, really the only experience you have to go on is yourself as a reader. What gives me this kind of emotional experience? And then you have to have the objectivity judging your own work to say, all right, did I pull that off? Because, I can't sit and watch over your shoulder as you, read my book, go, oh, he looks pretty tense now. This is great. I mean, I could try, and you guys are like, Don's a weirdo. But so it's that I think for every endeavor, what you are trying to, there's a saying in marketing that people don't buy drills, they buy holes. In other words, what they want is the result. They don't care how it works. And the less they have to know about how it works, the better. But the creators do have to know. And but sometimes it can be interesting as a user to kind of like know what's behind the scenes. I mean, we all go to a magic show. We want to know, how does the trick work? And then I think Penn from Penn and Teller once explained, like, you really don't want to know. You think you want to know to satisfy your curiosity, but the fact is it's actually kind of boring. Like, once you know it and demystify it, it's not like there's like some amazing puzzle. No, it's really just kind of like brute engineering and kind of knowing this is where somebody's attention will be. And I have this little wood thing that shifts this way and so on. It's not that sexy. And in many ways, I think that's true as a writer of, you want to know like how the writer did it, but you don't really want to know. You just want that experience.
I can understand that feeling as an author, and it surely isn't the same as the inspirational effect of experiencing the art itself. But when you do experience the art enough, and you do start seeing start taking apart how the artist has done it, that can actually enhance my appreciation. Again, wow, brilliant, how cool, and subtle effects that had a psychological effect on me when I first read the story. I'm now suddenly real. That's how the author did that to me. He set me up over here, and he used this trick and that trick, and of course I was going to feel this at the end. But that, instead of taking away from the experience, seeing the plumbing actually increases my appreciation for it. So I think it's two things. It's certainly not the experience of the novel itself, but when details, Marianne Suarez, she pointed out, for example, in Michelangelo's creation of man, that moment right before God's got his finger coming down to Adam, who's sitting there limply in the famous thing. She said, it's just that little space between. It's that second before life is given to man by God, creates this sort of emotional dynamic. Now, I had never thought of it that way before. I felt the excitement and the drama, but by having an expert, a visual art expert, point out to me how the artist created that excitement, that sense of anticipation, suddenly made me appreciate the painting a lot more. So reading Ayn Rand on the Principles of Literature, for example, enormously increases my appreciation for novels, and will enormously increase my appreciation, I think, of your novel when I read it. Even if I miss a lot of it, coming back around especially, I'll probably have a whole new dimension of appreciating your skill in how you did it to me.
No, I mean, that's a really good point. And I mean, I take it, it actually is not really a great analogy with magic, because there the whole value is in the I don't know how you did it. And with art, it really is the opposite. A better analogy is sort of like the way I always think about it is, um, you know, like my friend is a sommelier, and you can drink wine and go, "Oh, that was really good." But then when you start to see deeper into it, and they can like explain, like, here's what's going on, and we can kind of break it apart and see what did that whole, what made it possible, and you can now see the purpose of every little piece of it. It enriches your experience. Just like, if you go to a baseball game and you just know the basic rules, oh, they got to run. But if you know, hey, look at, where the shortstop moved right there, that's because this batter does this thing in these kind of situations, and so on. That kind of being able to see more enriches the experience to a great degree. And so there is, I mean, there's, I mean, I encourage everybody for kind of more philosophic reasons to read art of fiction, but as a reader, it increases your enjoyment. But this is particularly true of art because, particularly when we're talking about great art and not sort of just beach reading, which there's nothing wrong with beach reading, but the kind of things that you can revisit, part of revisiting them is that you can start to see the kind of richer meaning of all these little details. And part of that is understanding sort of how the author is making things happen.
The first
To
time
you.
the first time I read Atlas Shrugged, on the very first page, the idea that the New York skyline is magnificent but has the colors of a faded masterpiece, or that the bum who's asking for a dime has intelligent eyes. Now, both of those are visual concretes that dramatically express the theme of the role of the mind concretely. And her particular approach, you see, the mind is going on strike. And this is the effect. But before I know that, before I've read the novel all the way through, it's already having a psychological effect on me and preparing me in a sort of perceptual and an emotional way. It gets me in the mood. It sets the mood. It sets the agenda in the first few pages by giving us those kind of concretes, even if we don't understand them. But once I understand the plot theme of Atlas Shrugged, now I go back for my whatever time it is that I've read it. Now all those details leap out at me as powerful, poetic. And the first chapter of Atlas Shrugged is one of the most awesome mood-setting moments in all of literature, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'm having this experience right now, sort of from the other end, or rather from the same end, in filmmaking, like starting to learn about, okay, why are they shooting things this way? Like, why a close up? What does that do to the audience member? And it completely, it's that same experience of going from having an emotional reaction to kind of being in awe about, oh, that's why I had that emotional reaction, particularly when you see that something as subtle as where the camera was placed was made in order to execute this large scale vision that the person had, not just, to create an emotion within a particular scene, but because they're doing like Rand, they wanted the small details that added up, to the larger thing. And no, I mean, that's what makes art hard, but that's what makes really great art endlessly rewarding, because there is that kind of thought that went into every decision about it.
We're reaching the final time for today's essay. Don, James, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, my only thought is everyone should go out and get I Am Justice. It's available at Amazon or other formats. I got it. I can't recommend it because I haven't read it yet, but you can just hear from this discussion with Don what a brilliant communicator he is, and I am looking forward to reading it very much.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I mean, I should tell everybody just briefly, like, this is not, I mean, it's a work by an objectivist, but it's a crime story. Now, it has philosophic content. It is a thriller with kind of depth that goes into certain moral issues, but this is not this is not propaganda for the cause. My goal is just to give people a really interesting hero and an exciting page turning experience. But but I think it's really fun, and certainly I had fun writing it and writing the follow-up. But I appreciate it. And I will say that certainly my writing of it was shaped in large part by reading, I mean, basic principles, but then you can see kind of Rand's expanded take on it in The Art of Fiction. And so, I think those are, anybody who's interested in the stuff we've been discussing, Art of Fiction is kind of where I would go next. And I think ARI just made it free on Ayn Rand Campus and the Ayn Rand University app, which is amazing. And this is like a $300 course. And it's really one of the few times, I think it was recorded in Ayn Rand's living room. So it feels very personal. It's really the most intimate thing on tape that's publicly available from her, and is just an incredible treasure either to listen to or watch. And you can even hear a young Leonard Peikoff analyzing, I forget which work of art, but it's very funny because he's so self-deprecating about himself at a young age. And you realize that, like, I think he was 19 or 20 at the time that it's recorded. You realize, oh no, he was always brilliant.
Yeah.
So that's just as an aside.
Well, gosh, thank you very much for joining us today, Don. It's good to have you back in the saddle with us. Thank you.
Yeah, a real pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please join us next Tuesday for another essay.
Take care.